I would love to see more articles about restorative justice because that person is somebody's child. That abuser at one point was productive. At one point, something broke them. Where do they come from? They were loved at some point. I love that person, right? They were good to me, honestly, at one point. And then where did the damage happen that now they're homeless? And that's a part of our story. And that I had to make sure that my child knew that. But from the mouth of the person that did it, instead of adding that burden to my soul of like, I have to answer those questions. Wouldn't it be great, kind of like Otis shared about the lens of, okay, these are the abusers that created the crime, but what caused it? Who are they? Who are their parents? What community were they raised in? Were they your neighbors? Were they your colleagues? Were they your friends who ended up being the abusers? We should be able to see them too, because in the end, the only way to break the cycle is to understand where it begins.
As you're taking your seats, I want to welcome you to this Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Jenna Lane. I'm with Blue Shield of California Foundation. And along with California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, we are delighted to be sponsoring today's event. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the first of our speakers, Debbie Chang, President and CEO of Blue Shield of California Foundation, a champion of health equity and ending domestic violence, who understands that one of the ways to do that is by supporting journalists. Please join me in welcoming Debbie Chang.
Well, thank you so much, Jenna. And good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see everybody. I can tell this is going to be really an exciting event just by the people I've connected with already. I wanted to start by thanking each of you for coming. I know that you have different ways to spend your time, and you're choosing to be here, so thank you. Blue Shield of California Foundation, our mission is to end domestic violence in California and to have California be the healthiest state. Over the last 20 years, we've spent over $700 million toward that mission. And I've been here over 4 years, and since that time, we've been focused on being a catalyst for large-scale systems change so that we can reach as many people as possible. We work in California communities, throughout our state, with a focus on communities of color with low income, because that's the population that is most impacted by domestic violence and health inequity. At the foundation, we're trying to change the conversation on domestic violence. We want to move from talking about the symptoms of the problem to preventing domestic violence from happening in the first place. So how do we do that? By addressing its root causes, racism, economic insecurity, and gender inequity. And by working with all of you to change the conversation on domestic violence. We want people to talk openly about domestic violence, not treat it as a private issue that lurks beneath the waters. We also want people to talk about it as a health equity issue, where everyone deserves the chance to reach their full potential. And we want to talk about it as a multi-generational cycle that can be broken. Domestic violence is everywhere, but it's not inevitable. It's healable and preventable, and we all have a role to play in ending it. And journalists, with the stories you tell, you have an especially meaningful role to play in influencing change. So earlier I talked about the fact that we are focused and believe in systems change. Well, journalism is one of those systems. Journalists have the ability to reach large groups of people and improve their understanding of complex issues such as domestic violence and health inequity. When I was growing up, there wasn't much in the media about domestic violence. In the 90s, some of you may remember, and others will recall, that there was the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, and the subsequent O.J. Simpson trial. And as much as that story was everywhere, it did not substantially and sustainably change awareness about domestic violence or even shift perceptions. Mass shootings often bring domestic violence into the national limelight when we find out, as we often do, that there's a connection between the two. My point is, we often don't learn about domestic violence until it's reached a tragic stage or has become deadly. We learn shocking details, but we don't learn about the context, root causes, or solutions. We don't learn about the many moments that happened before the incident that, if addressed, could have prevented the incident from happening in the first place. We don't learn about the many moments after that can focus on healing, because healing is prevention for the next generation. But I'm happy to say now that thanks in part to many of you, things are changing. We're starting to change the conversation. Today, we're so pleased to be introducing the Journalist Playbook to continue changing the conversation on domestic violence. It's a tool we hope will help journalists who want to do more in-depth reporting, who want to be more trauma-informed when they're talking to survivors or their families, and who want to explore solutions. Telling the broader story about domestic violence is hard, but it's possible to explore root causes and solutions. For example, healing. We know that healing for children who are exposed to violence can break that multi-generational cycle of violence. And we know that restorative justice, which focuses on accountability of the harm doer with the survivor's wishes at the center, is an alternative to the criminal justice system in some cases. And we've seen excellent journalism in recent years, including from some of you in this room. Journalism that, for example, has increased the awareness of the role of financial abuse in 99% of domestic violence cases, or has illustrated that some child welfare laws can really work against survivors and their children, such as some failure to protect laws. And journalism that highlights the link between domestic violence and homelessness. Domestic violence is a cause of homelessness for women who are unhoused. You can't solve one without addressing the other. All of these stories point to the fact that you can report on root causes and solutions. Now, strong coverage like this is thanks to the many partners, some of whom are in this room, in the domestic violence field, and many of whom are survivors themselves. Our partners have important stories and expertise to share about how to prevent domestic violence, root causes, policy and solutions. And I want to especially thank the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, who is our co-host today. So today is an opportunity to bring great minds together, all of you. You're here because you care, because you're curious, because you want to make a difference. What I hope you'll do is learn from our experts today and our speakers, meet new people like I just did, and learn together. Better yet, what I hope you'll do is continue telling stories about survivors and about policy change and root causes and ways to prevent domestic violence. If there's one thing we've learned in our over 20 years of working on this issue, it's this: we can't end domestic violence alone. All of us have a role to play, and all of you have a role to play. And we need to make sure we're telling the stories of survivors and people who support survivors. And everyone in this room knows that how you tell that story makes the difference between sensationalism and genuine understanding that can lead to solutions and change. We hope that this playbook is a toolkit that you all can use so you can create context, point to root causes, and explore solutions. And if you have suggestions for us, by all means, please give them to us. With that, I'd like to welcome our speaker and ask her to come to the podium. She's a journalist and author who has put in time to learn from survivors and to learn about solutions and to start changing the conversation about domestic violence so we can end it. Please join me in welcoming Rachel Louise Snyder.
Thank you all. So, you know, I am a journalist, author, professor, mother, friend, but I really came to both journalism and domestic violence through a side door. I have an MFA in fiction, and I learned storytelling. Like, that's really fundamentally what I do, whether I'm doing journalism or some other type of writing. And one of the things you learn when you write fiction or nonfiction, when you write prose, is what we call a shadow narrative. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Philip Lopate. Philip Lopate's one of the great essayists of our age. And Philip Lopate talks about the shadow narrative of any story. And what he means when he says that is that there's the story on the page, you know, the story from the book that you're reading or the newspaper article you're reading, but there's always another shadow story behind it. So, for example, in a memoir, you're going to have the story that you're reading, and then you're going to have the author's retrospective narration going on behind that story. And the reason that that is important is because that's what makes sense. That's how you make sense of a story, right? People tell me all the time, if I'm sure we've got a lot of writers in the room right now, and you've probably heard this too. Oh, I've got a story. Everybody tells me I should write a book. I'm like, yeah, you can write a book, but it's not the life that matters. It's how you make sense of the life. And that's the shadow narrative that comes in. And that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about today from a journalistic perspective. Because it turns out that domestic violence has this same thing. Domestic violence has a shadow narrative behind every story. Anytime a victim interacts with a person, a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer, a police officer, a friend, there's this snapshot of what's happening. But there's also a whole entire narrative in shadow, the story behind that is a much bigger story. And that's, I think, what the media really needs to understand. I'm going to illustrate this briefly with a story from my third book, which is called No Visible Bruises: What We Don't Know About Domestic Violence Can Kill Us. And it's a story about a rattlesnake. Because if you're a writer, you know that the best stories contain within them an image, right? So I want you to hold an image of a rattlesnake in your mind. There's a young man named Rocky. He meets a girl named Michelle. Michelle is 14 when she meets him. At 15, she gives birth to her first baby by him. He's 25 at the time. He's 10 years older. They have a little preemie baby named Kirsty. Oh my gosh, So I have a stepdaughter named Kirsty, and forever those names are intermingled into a neural pathway that just can't disentangle. Kirsty. Anyway, she gives birth to a little premature daughter who spends about 2 months in the NICU. This, by the way, is foreshadowing. So anybody who is really keeping track of the writing piece of this lesson, the shadow narrative, you might say, of this talk, that is a little bit of foreshadowing. So Michelle and Rocky have a child. She stays in school. She's in high school. And when she's 17, she gives birth to her second child, a little boy named Kyle. And she's still living at home with her mother. Her parents are divorced, but very amicable. And they live in Billings, Montana. And when she gives birth to the second child, Kyle, she tells her mother, look, this is ridiculous and I'm still living at home. I have 2 kids with this man. I'm going to go live with him. He lives in a trailer park on the outskirts of Billings. And her mother doesn't want her to do that, but she feels like she has no real say in the matter. And so Michelle and the 2 little kids move into the trailer. And Michelle continues to go to high school. This is how incredible she is, actually. She's got 2 little kids under the age of 3, one of whom has constant health problems from being a preemie with undeveloped lungs. Excuse me. And she graduates on time. She still graduated. I have to say, I never even graduated. Like, I'm so impressed with her. I was invited by Naperville North High School in suburban Illinois to leave at the end of my sophomore year and not return. That's in my memoir. Anyway, so Michelle moves in with Rocky, graduates from high school on time. Rocky works for a seismic crew, so he's in and out of town a lot, and he decides that he doesn't want to be away from his family, and so he quits that job, and he never has regular full-time work again. Now, economics is not a cause of domestic violence, right? Joblessness is not a cause of domestic violence, but it is a stressor. You heard Debbie say that homelessness intersects domestic violence, especially for women. In fact, domestic violence is the number one cause of homelessness for women in this country. So they live in this little tiny trailer park. Michelle graduates. Rocky's kind of in and out of work. And Michelle's father says, look, this is ridiculous the way you're living. Why don't you guys move into my house in Billings, and I'm gonna build a bigger, better house on the outskirts of town, and I'll rent it to you cheap. And that's what they do. So they're living in this little house, and things are not going well. We don't know exactly what's going on, but we know enough that Michelle goes to her father at some point and says, I'm really unhappy. I think I'm going to try and go to college and get a nursing degree so that I can afford to raise these kids and get Rocky out of the house. And she does that. She goes to Montana State University, where, by the way, the financial aid office, because she has no tax returns, says, well, you better get us your husbands. And she says, I'm not married. And they say, well, you better get married then. And so she ends up going to the Justice of the Peace that very day. And here is a bureaucratic system that is embedding a woman further with a man that she is actively trying to leave. At the same time, her father says, well, I don't know what's going on with you and Rocky, but if things are really bad, I'll tell you what we'll do. Let's put the house in your name. I'll sell it to you for $1. We'll write up a land contract. His name won't be on the deed. And that way, when you need to get him out of the house, you won't have any legal issues because his name won't be anywhere on it. And that is what they do. And Rocky never knows that. This is the shadow story behind Michelle's story, right? This, by the way, is what leaving looks like. You'll see a statistic over and over again that it takes 7 or 8 or 8 or 9 times for a domestic violence victim to leave an abuser. I have a couple things to say about that. Number one, I don't think it's 7 or 8 times or 9 times. I think it's 1 time, years in the making. I think it is a set of careful maneuvers. Every single one of them is a negotiation. Like, what do I have to do to get a nursing degree so I can raise my kids? Oh my gosh, I'm going to have to marry this guy, right? That's one of them. The other thing I want to say about that is that question has within it the presupposition that it is reasonable that we ask a woman to leave her home, but not the man who is abusing her or the partner who is abusing her. So, Michelle is tiptoeing into leaving, right? Now, I want to just say one thing about the media here. I see over and over and over again the term domestic dispute in the media. And if you are a journalist out there today, I urge you to go back to your newsrooms and say, you know what, this is really minimizing violence. Because when we have a burglary at a bank, we don't call it an economic dispute. When someone breaks into your house, we don't say, my God, it's a consumer dispute, right? So let's think about the language that we're using. Even cops, I've done so many drive-alongs, and you always hear them, it's a domestic. They take out the words violence altogether. Like, the language really matters, right? We also minimize domestic violence when we interview a neighbor and the neighbor goes, I don't know, he seems so nice. How about you interview someone who is actually close to the victim, a family member or a friend who can say, you know what, she was scared. That's the story, right? We minimize it most of all when we see a murder-suicide, and somewhere in that story, it'll say, 2 children were unharmed. Children are never unharmed in a domestic violence situation, especially when there's a murder-suicide. Gosh, somebody should number my pages. And that somebody should be me, but. So, Rocky is abusive to Michelle, but nobody in her family knows that because she never comes out with any bruises. She never has any. We really prioritize physical evidence of abuse. This is where I want to get back to that rattlesnake. See how I foreshadowed and now I'm bringing it back into the story. You're all going to be like, whoa, we know how to screen right now. So Rocky, it turns out, and you'll have to read No Visible Bruises if you want. The first 100 pages are devoted to Rocky and Michelle's story if you really want. This is just a very quick snapshot. But Rocky has done things like use the children as leverage to get Michelle to do what he wants. And he's done things like isolate her from her family by saying things like, you know, Michelle, your family really doesn't like me and I'm so uncomfortable around them and I want us to spend holidays with my family. By the way, he wasn't wrong. Her family did hate him. He impregnated her at 15 when he was 25 years old. Yes, they had ill will toward him. He also would say things like, oh, Michelle, you know, you are so beautiful, but I see the way men look at you when you wear makeup and miniskirts out. So I think for your own protection, you shouldn't. This is the language of abuse. This isn't a man saying, I refuse to allow you to wear miniskirts. No, right? It's like when Trump says, I'm going to protect all women. And I just want to say, I shouldn't be political, but I live in DC and that's just the way it is. And I just want to say, you know what? That's real nice of you and all. But how about we create a world in which we don't need your protection? Thank you. So Rocky would do these things like use the kids as leverage, or insult Michelle. He was very emotionally abusive. At one point, he did threaten her with her own grandfather's hunting rifle, but she called his parents and they came over and took the rifle away and they thought the problem was solved, right? Over and over again, we saw that Rocky was getting giving these messages to Michelle, and that Michelle was getting these messages because every time she changed her behavior. She tried a different system. She tried his parents. She tried her father. This last time, Rocky had brought a snake into the house, a rattlesnake, a venomous rattlesnake, and he kept it in a cage in their living room and said, I'm going to put this in bed with you, or I'm going to put this in the shower with you if you do anything to piss me off. This is coercive control. When you hear that phrase, coercive control, I want you to think of a rattlesnake because that is what it looks like. Michelle tried many systems. She tried education. She tried healthcare, actually. She tried the police one time. She tried the judiciary. She filed for a restraining order one time. And she tried informal systems, her family, his family, her dad, her mom, her sister. Each system had one attempt and only one. This is the thing. You don't know the whole shadow story if you don't seek it out. The jurisdictions that I have spoken to or seen in my 15, 16 years of reporting on domestic violence that are really making the biggest difference, first of all, they have reductions in the homicides of men. So it's arguable that in some ways the women's movement is really good for men because women don't have to kill their way out of a situation, out of a violent situation. But also the jurisdictions that are the ones that have made real change are the jurisdictions where they have worked together across these systems. And they're able to say, this is our one piece of it. What's your one piece of it? They put together the shadow narrative. You know, as writers and journalists, we have a very simple job. There's really only one question that you ever have to ask. What is the system that we're investigating? Who's benefiting and who's losing? My book, No Visible Bruises, is really an attempt to right the system of the media. I mean, by right, I mean correct. Well, I also the other right too. I guess it's a pun, kind of. But it really was me realizing everything that we were getting wrong in that story. We were asking, why didn't she just leave? We were saying the kids are unharmed. But now all of you in this room can no longer say that you don't know, because you know now, right? And we need to have the corrections to these systems, because the fact is 16% of girls ages 15 to 24 have been victims of domestic violence just in the past 12 months. In 2022, according to the UN, homicides of women and girls spiked after 2 full decades of decreasing numbers. In 2022, around the world, 89,000 women and girls were killed. And by the way, only a little over half the countries report to UN Women. I'm really bad at math because, as I said, I was invited to leave my high school, but 89 times 2 plus a few more, that's a lot. I can't do the math on that. North America, that same year, had a 29% increase in femicides. So people ask me what you can do. Here's what I'll leave you with, and then we'll open it up to questions. Ask yourself what systems you're part of. Formally, like your work system, right? Maybe your church system, whatever, but then more informally, your friend group, your book group. You're all in book groups. I know you are. Bring this conversation into that group. I'm sure many of us are following the trial in France of Giselle Pelicot. And she says shame needs to change sides. She is absolutely correct. And one of the ways that we do that is by talking about it, by creating the space for survivors, for victims to be able to talk about it so they can become survivors, right? And that is on all of us. So, one of the things just about me personally is that I come from a family of salespeople. Like my dad was a salesman, my uncle was a salesman, and we are just talkers. Like we just can talk. And so I do think like journalism came somewhat naturally to me because I just talk to people and I'm, legitimately interested in their stories. But I will say, I was saying to one of the panelists earlier today, I just did a study with Stanford Law School that I published in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, and we interviewed 650 women incarcerated in the state of California who all had homicide charges. And I wasn't allowed to go in the prisons as a journalist because California doesn't allow media in their prisons. Okay, that'll be a talk for like next week. I'm going to come back and talk about that fiasco. But anyway, I had to go through, I was doing this with 7 other proctors, 3 of whom were formerly incarcerated women who together had served a collective 81 years between these 2 prisons that we were interviewing women in. And I had to go through proctor training. And as part of that proctor training, and by the way, let me just say, my ego was all wrapped up in this because I was very resistant to it. And I was like, I've been interviewing people for 30 years. I know what I'm doing. And they were like, well, if you want to be a proctor, you have to do it. And it was incredibly humbling because I realized I really had not, until this training, been very trauma informed. I was compassionate. I was empathetic, I was patient, but I wasn't looking out for people I wasn't kind of saying we're in a shared community. And as a journalist, I do believe there is something along the lines of the Hippocratic Oath that we need to take that says do no harm to the people that you're writing about. So the first thing I do now is and I only interview people who are going to tell me awful stories. Like that's just, violence is this just the way of it. So the first thing I do is say, before we get anywhere, or before we even start, I want to tell you what I'm going to do. I want to tell you that if you want to go off the record, you tell me it's off the record. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that everything is on the record. I'm going to tell you what you can reasonably ask of me, the journalist, and what I am obligated to give to you, right? Sometimes people are very surprised that they can't see the story, right, before you write, but they can see their quotes for accuracy. So I'm very clear about like making them understand that. But then I say, now let's talk about you for a minute. You're going to share some pretty deep stuff with me. What does the next 24 to 48 hours look like for you? Do you have friends that you can call if things get harried? And the Stanford project that I did, where we interviewed all those women, we worked with the two prisons so that they had a social worker or a clergy member on call, so that for any of the women who found it very difficult. And it was incredible for me to see. You know, normally when you go into, I've been in plenty of prisons, you normally just interview one person at a time. You see like one, incarcerated person at a time. But here, doing this study, we were seeing like dozens at a time. And so you really saw them in their natural element in terms of their social constructs. So they're supporting each other. Many of them are crying. Many of them are unhealthy. Women in their 20s, 30s, 40s using walkers and canes. Like you get a sense of just how damaging prison is for the physical body. So that's one thing. That other part of your question is, how do you know where to draw the line? There are many stories that I've written over the years where mothers in particular do not want their children to know that the father raped them. And I just leave that out. I just leave those things out when they ask me. I always leave it. I think, the rule at the New Yorker and the New York Times is you can't ever change any information, but you can leave information out, identifying information. So hopefully that's helpful. I'm going to leave you with one final thought, which is that we need to know what victims like Michelle and her children cannot say. It's up to us to understand these shadow narratives, not them. It's on us. Gandhi, that guy, that crazy guy, my favorite Gandhi quote was, "In a gentle way, you can shake the world." And this is what I want to leave you with. Let's gently shake our world. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us here. I'm so excited to be part of this event and gathering to celebrate the soft launch of the Journalist Playbook. My name is Michelle Levander. I'm a veteran journalist and the founding director of the Center for Health Journalism at the University of Southern California. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, and the center partners with reporters and newsrooms in California and across the country to produce ambitious journalism on health equity themes. Domestic violence is a core topic for us. With that reporting, we've seen the power of reframing the narrative through journalism to bring attention and action from lawmakers and judges and change perspectives for ordinary people. As a start, we have to name domestic violence as a public health epidemic and a health equity issue, not a private matter or, only too often, a one-day crime story. With this conversation today, we have the opportunity to come together and share ideas and best practices when it comes to the role of journalism. We have 4 distinguished speakers, each representing various paths to this topic. So please join me in welcoming Sami Kayola, an award-winning Philadelphia-based journalist who reports on police accountability, sexual violence, and mental health. Sami is also an advisor to the Journalist Playbook. Angela Kim, a writer and domestic violence survivor who works to prevent domestic violence among young people at the LA County Department of Youth Development. And Angela is also an advisor to the Journalist Playbook. Yenny Rivera, a domestic violence survivor and restorative justice advocate who helps homeless families and those escaping domestic violence for the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. And we also have Otis R. Taylor Jr., managing editor of News and Enterprise at KQED, whose role includes working with reporters and senior editors to change the systemic inequities in journalism and to reframe the station's coverage of the Bay Area's diverse communities. So let's get underway by inviting all of you into this conversation. We want to know who's in the room, both in the auditorium and the virtual room of those watching on the live stream. We're going to use a tool called Mentimeter that will display everyone's responses on the screens on either side of the stage and on Zoom. And to share your replies, you first open a web browser on your phone or other device and go to menti.com. That's MENTI.com. And you'll see a prompt to enter an 8-digit code. That code is 1321-8413. Let me just say it one more time, 1321-8413. And so we'll start by asking all of you an opening question. What is your role in changing the conversation about domestic violence? And it's fine to select more than one option, as we know some of you have multiple roles. And some of those choices... I'm sorry, do you want the code again? 1321-8413. And it's Menti, MENTI.com. And we'll be using this app multiple times as a way for us to have a two-way conversation. So it looks like either, my research hat tells me, either journalists are one of the biggest groups, advocates, or they're the best at using Menti.com. Hard to know which one. And our next related question is, what community do you represent or serve? And it's an open-ended question. You might say something like South Asians in the Bay Area or journalists in the Central Valley or whatever feels like the right fit for you. So while we wait for those responses to come in, now that we've introduced you to the panelists and the panelists to you, we'll have a few questions on the Mentimeter platform as our conversation continues. Let's just call out some of these. California communities of color, Bay Area youth, youth across the U.S., women-identified survivors in San Francisco. A lot of rich, responses here. So let's turn now to our panel. And Angela, let's start with you. So you're a survivor, a youth violence prevention advocate, and a writer. And I want to read a short excerpt of your writing that really can jumpstart our discussion about how journalists can play a role in domestic violence. You say, since leaving my abuser, I've devoted my professional life to violence prevention. As a survivor of teenage dating violence, my passion is to educate children, teenagers, parents, and guardians about healthy relationships and how to have conversations about abuse. You add, preventing teenage dating violence is not the teenager's burden to carry. It takes a village. So what do you see, Angela, as a role of media in building that village? And for the journalists in the room, what do you see as the opportunities and the responsibilities and the ways to be a builder?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I recently had a conversation with a colleague in the field, and I was sharing about how I had a lot of disappointments in myself, a lot of guilt, shame, because I didn't leave my abuser fast enough, whatever that meant, right? And my colleague shared something that profoundly changed my mindset. She said, "Your community failed you." And I thought back to all the teachers and friends and priests and soccer coaches in my life who looked away when I showed up with bruises, who looked away when I started withdrawing into myself, who looked away, didn't intervene when I really started to become a shell of a person and I wasn't the person I was anymore. And I would start to slowly ask these people in my village, hey, like, what is abuse? What is violence? Like, do you know people who have gone through this? Just so I could start to slowly parse out what was going on in my life and make sense of it. And a lot of the people in my village, they went to the media and they started reading these sensationalized stories around domestic violence. And they would typically share, oh, this victim died, this victim was murdered. And of course, we want to recognize the victims who have been murdered due to violence. When I was 16, that was so terrifying that I thought I was going to die. And I remember when my abuser would lay his hands on me and strangle me, I knew what that felt like. I knew what it felt like that I was going to die. And so my perception of domestic violence was really shaped by these extreme cases instead of it being more normalized and covert. And I just grew more and more terrified to leave every day because I was seeing these headlines. This victim was murdered, this other victim was murdered. And I didn't really see a lot of reporting done on thriving survivors, resiliency, solutions, prevention. And so when I think back to this question, Michelle, I think media has such a huge role in this village, in everyone's village, because messaging is really shaped by media. Norms are shaped by media. So as a builder, I think that journalists can really dig into the complexities of domestic violence and report on the entire spectrum of domestic violence. I really think a lot about Rachel Louise Snyder's quote in the book where she talks about how domestic violence is really murky, but then when you look in hindsight, it was actually so crystal clear. So I think journalists in Building the Bridge could make it less murky because domestic violence really thrives in ambiguity. So to make it less murky can really help victims and survivors as well.
Thank you. That's just so thoughtful and so helpful. And it just seems like silence itself does tremendous harm and not showing these possibilities. So I want to turn to all of you in the room and also in the virtual room and ask you to think about what has just been shared with us and ask, how would you describe coverage of domestic violence today in maybe 1 or 2 words? And we'll get a word cloud if all goes well. And this is on the Mentimeter. Sensational, scary, sad, incomplete, insufficient, uninformed, abysmal. We got work to do, guys. Yeah, very helpful. So as those descriptions are coming in, I want to read another excerpt from Angela's writing and ask both you and Yenny to share your thoughts in response. Angela, you wrote about your youth violence prevention work that I realize that most students do not have a clear understanding of a healthy relationship. It is often difficult for young people to judge whether or not a behavior is abusive. Some view violence and abuse in relationships as normal and inevitable, most often due to romantic portrayals in media. Now, I know that media encompasses popular culture and social media, but when it comes to journalism, for the two of you, what would you like to see changed, and what's missing from the reporting that you see? How can journalism sometimes make matters worse? Yenny, do you want to get us started?
Sure, and I like that you said what might be missing. So to go back to what you've been sharing in Spanish, there is a good quote that says, "From love to hate is just one step." And I think that's where maturity comes with life experience. Maturity. I was like, I could tell that it's probably not. Okay. So in Spanish, which is my culture, right? Latin, there's a saying that I grew up with, which says, "From love to hate, there's just one step." So connecting that to what Angela has shared is, there's something that comes with maturity of life experience and reasoning maturity, which is that area between what is a passionate person who might passionately love you, who is just intense, and somebody who is obsessive, an aggressive behavior. And you don't learn that early on. But to add to that, how about those young children, adolescents, youth that have added trauma to their, maturity journey, right? Or what if they have survived trauma upon trauma? And I don't mean just fostering youth, which is a big trauma, and dealing with abandonment, but also I was a product, for example, I was an accident child. And because of my culture, that language that was used, nobody ever took the time to let my culture know that it makes a difference and it is going to create an impact on my brain. And now, as in my early 40s, I'm dealing with the aftermath of trauma, which is forgetting, having memory issues, ADD, hyperfocus, and it's very difficult. And it's all connected to those destroyed synapses that now I have, that trauma created. Why not have articles that also expose that, teach that as prevention? How do we raise our children when we have survived trauma? What is the way that we can break that cycle? Why not also talk about in the education system, which is the village that we need to raise our children, right? As we're escaping domestic violence, why not include trauma, PTSD that our children are surviving, our teenagers are surviving as part of the wraparound services that we target? Why is it not included in the 504 files that, autism is included and all these programs are created for that, which is so needed. But how about for homelessness and DV, which is connected? Because every survivor that decides to leave automatically, guess what, becomes homeless. It's unstable. There's that connection, and your children are seeing that. The teenagers are living that. And even when you're a teenager and you're deciding to, leave, you're creating anxiety, PTSD, that you're going to encounter with. How about not having articles that teach us how to create a village that provides wraparound services for that youth, for those children, in education? I love what Rachel shared. How about teachers that get yearly training in trauma-informed teaching? It doesn't exist. And California has the highest number of children and teenagers that are surviving DV, the aftermath of DV. How does it not exist in California? So why not bring attention to that aspect of it instead of just the aftermath? I think that's where the gap exists.
Thank you so much for sharing, Annie. I think back to when I was 16 and experiencing abuse. I was not only, of course, experiencing all that came with abuse, but I was also witnessing domestic violence in the home. I was also with my family was living under the federal poverty line. My parents are immigrants. They don't speak English very well. They're also Catholic, which does not let you divorce, even though there's violence going on. And I was also a child with a learning disability. So there were so many different things going in all my life where I was also experiencing something completely new and so horrible at the same time. And I think that that might resonate with a lot of other survivors and victims in that there's a lot that young people go through, and they have to learn like healthy behaviors and relationships and all that. So when I think back to what the question is around, like what feels missing, I think that stories are presented as like domestic violence is an isolated incident. It's a tragic incident, but it really needs to be further contextualized as part of broader social issues that are going on that are impacting our young people today. And really shifting from these sensationalized stories and providing more context around the prevalence of it. Of course, going into the social roots around the social determinants of health, really framing it as a health equity issue, power dynamics, all these things. And just to wrap up, really going back to the question of why does violence occur in the first place? What are the root causes? Let's explore those and really focus on the root causes of this and the stressors, as Debbie mentioned earlier, to domestic violence.
I just want to say that in answering these questions so eloquently, I know that it must be evoking a lot of things too, and I want to thank you both for sharing all this. Thank you. So I want to turn to all of you and have you all weigh in. By now, you and the Mentimeter are old friends. So how would you like to see domestic violence coverage change? What could be different? And these could be short answers or just a phrase. A lot of this seems to build on what we're hearing from our panelists. More interest in covering solutions that are already in communities, more about solutions, more on prevention, more data. That's a passion of mine, too. So, Otis, let's turn to you. And as KQED's managing editor of News and Enterprise, you work with reporters at all stages of their careers. And you've said that you put front and center the role of systemic inequity in journalism. So what do you think is missing in the way that journalists are covering domestic violence? And how might they inadvertently reinforce stereotypes and misconceptions? And what are the opportunities to do things differently?
Journalists don't know how to talk to people in varied ways. For instance, recently, a man was sentenced for killing his partner, a transgender woman who identified as Black and Puerto Rican. We published a story, and yeah, the first quote is speaking favorably about the woman who lost their life. But there's no context in this story. There's no one who knows the woman and who can tell you about their life. I sent someone to USC, Blanca Torres, to write about mental health in Latino households. We chose a family in East Palo Alto. If you know anything about EPA, it is impoverished. There's been divestment, particularly in brown neighborhoods. We focused on a woman raising 3 children, single mother, Latino. She has a transgender child, but she does not know how to relate to her family, explain to her family why she has allowed the child to express themselves in this way. I think journalists are afraid to tell stories that are outside of their comfort zone. I want to say thank you, Angela. Thank you, Yenny. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Debbie, for the inspiration and really the support in this playbook to try some different things. So I can say today that after we get over the hurdle of this election, in 2025, KQED will be reporting on domestic violence regularly, but we won't be just on someone being sentenced for killing their partner. We want to get out there and talk to people who have experienced the violence. I have a rule. If you're going to write about the unhoused population and what's wrong and what we can do to help, if you don't have someone who has experienced, then you're not providing the context or really the depth that I expect. I think it's all about expectations, and I'm lucky at KQED that I can create space for reporters like Blanca Torres, who went to USC to.
And did a fabulous job, I have to say.
Well, exactly. And she is one of the reporters that I expect every time you come to me with a story, that it's going to be a story that I haven't read or heard before, and that actually centers people, real people that you could see, our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers, people on the street.
Yeah, thank you. And would you describe domestic violence as a health equity issue and a public health epidemic? What are you seeing in the communities that you all cover at KQED?
Without a doubt. I mean, we're talking about billions of dollars spent on policing, right? On mental health services, children, right? The impact on children today, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, is it cyclical? Does it become generational? We are spending so much money when we can provide people resources on the front end. And I will say, when we publish stories, I want to have a guide so people can have resources if they read the story, if they want. I really feel if we're going to say we're community focused, let's really be about that and invite people to learn or to connect with resources that could help them, their friend, their neighbor, their mom, their dad, anyone.
What I'm hearing from you too is that you're both asking different questions and you're coming in at different points in the story, not just these horrific endings, and that in that way you could be part of the prevention and the village building.
Yeah, it's what journalists in the profession has done for decades. Is this terrible thing happens, right? That's it, right? This terrible thing happened, but there's all that happened before. Where is that? Shout out to the Shadow story. Where is that in this? And it requires, I believe, a raising of expectations. And you could ask any reporter, Blanca included, I am demanding because I expect you to present the audience with something they haven't read or heard before.
And I think we have an obligation to do something different. And Sammy, I wanted to ask you for a comment on that.
I just want to thank you, Otis, for making space for reporters to do this kind of work, because as a reporter, I've so often had to fight for the space, because centering humans and doing it in a way that's trauma-informed, it really takes a lot of time and a lot of care on the part of journalists. And I think journalists don't really know how to provide care in the journalistic process, and you have to I had to learn how to do that, and having, editors who allow that space is part of solving the media problem, I think. I'm happy to talk more about that. But as far as it being a public health issue, yeah, absolutely, everything that you said, the root causes that you brought up, Angela, that's what we need to be looking into.
And Sammy, we've known each other for a little while, for a minute, right? And I think you've been very creative in doing something that certainly doesn't come out of the traditional journalism school model, which is to ask your sources to collaborate with you on building the story and to recognize that there's a real power dynamic between the reporter and the source. You're holding the mic, right? And how do you hand the mic over to your source, collaborate with them, and help them feel like they have some agency over their own story?
Yeah, I came up in traditional newsrooms where it was very much about just getting information, and people were just sources of information for my story. And after a while, I just couldn't really stomach that anymore. And I just started to think about control and the way that survivors feel they've lost control. And then what is the role of journalists in helping them regain some of that? How can we reshape a journalistic process that that empowers rather than extracts? How can journalism be a channel for healing? And there's a lot of tools you can use that I've picked up over the years. Rachel talked about informed consent, being completely transparent from the get-go about how I see this working and how do you feel about it? Does this work for you? What do you need to feel safe? How do you want to be called? Do we need to change your voice? Who do you want to have with you at the interview? Where do you want it to happen? I have talked to survivors who said, okay, if we're going to do this day, like, please don't change the day on me because I'm going to make a therapy appointment for that day, or like, I'm going to not go to work that day. And that helped me to realize, wow, the questions I'm asking you, like, they are affecting your whole day, your whole week. Like, this is not just a conversation for you. This is your health. And, so there's just ways of thinking differently when you're working with people who have experienced and are experiencing trauma. And I found that when you do that and you bring them along for the process, also reading back parts of quotes, I did things like, hey, so one of my projects was about reporting sexual violence to law enforcement, how law enforcement responds. I would say, I'm going to be interviewing Sacramento PD this week. I'm going to be interviewing the Sheriff's Department this week. What questions do you have? Because of course they had questions, they'd been through the process. That's helpful for me too. I wouldn't know that they had issues with certain parts unless I asked them for that feedback. So it was collaborative in that way, and I think they felt that they were really part of it and they got a lot out of it too.
Thank you. Yenny, I want to turn back to you. Journalists sometimes report things in a kind of black and white way with a clear cast of characters. There's the victim or the survivor, the cops who may or may not arrive on time, and the abuser. And it's not as easy to portray the complexity of these situations, that the abuser may be part of a multi-generational story of trauma, and also that you may not always want to call the cops. You may come from a community that has a lot of mistrust or bad experiences with the cops. And there's a kind of less well-known approach, since we're talking about other kinds of stories, restorative justice, which may be familiar to all of you in school settings or so on, but it's also something that's playing out in domestic violence. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that in the context of your own life with your formerly abusive partner, and how that helped you to heal. And I want to just read a little bit about what you said about that. You said, I always carry a scar in my soul, but it no longer bleeds. I don't face questions from my son that I'm unable to answer, and it took nearly a decade. But making sure both my son and my heart were ready was the best decision. Do it on your terms and make sure you're walking toward it at every step.
Sorry. I always think I'm gonna be okay, and you never know, right? I think it's just emotion from happiness. Because it is, I love that somebody put healing and put that prevention, because it is part of, I think we need a better view about the back end healing, right? And what does it look like? And thank you, both of you, for the way that you say collaborative, because in this report, Hannah and Claudia Boyd with the California Health Report did such a great way of holding my hand as I was gonna go through the decade long, because it's not like, oh yeah, I'm gonna forgive and we're gonna be fine, we're good. Please read it. It took a long journey. I had to just summarize it, but it took a long journey. And so the thing is that the fact of the matter is that even though part of what Rachel shared was that there are 5 million incidents that are statistically based, right, that are believed to be connected to domestic and in the U.S., right, that 1 of 4 of those around you have encountered that, have experienced that, right? These are facts. These are our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, our children, our sisters, our brothers, right? Because it comes in many forms. But only half of those that get reported, statistic-based, only half of those that get reported will ever see a court date. Mine never did. And I had to take pictures and everything. Mine never did. And so 97% of those will end up taking a plea. Usually that means there will be no jail time. Look it up. There's rarely any jail time. So how is that going to vindicate me? How is that going to bring me healing? So I had to, knowing that, I had to find my path. And so I recommend that path for those that it will work, because I had to think about my healing and my child's healing. So it wasn't just connecting it back to the first question, right? And connecting it back to how do we break stories about the front end. They're victims. When we have children, they are also victims of domestic violence along with us. And so I had to think about my healing and his healing. How do I break the cycle? How do I make sure that he doesn't fall into becoming an aggressor? Because once I learned, I sat down and I listened to his father, I understood why he became who he became. And so I saw him. And for that glimpse of moment, I saw him again. And it was easier for me to say, okay, it doesn't excuse it. It doesn't erase what happened. But it helped me find my healing, for me to then find a new person, right? Who is a good soul. And who, along with me, joined my journey to restorative justice to say, yeah, you definitely connect. There was no of like, wait, that's going to be my son now. You're going to bring him to go see their father. What? No, it was like, no, on the contrary, I'll drive you. You know, who says that, right? I'll drive you both. Definitely. This is good for that heart, right? So what does it look for each person is different. But I would love to see more articles about restorative justice, because that person is somebody's child. That abuser at one point was productive. At one point, something broke them. Where do they come from? They were loved at some point. I love that person, right? They were good to me, honestly, at one point. And then where did the damage happen that now they're homeless? And that's a part of our story. And that I had to make sure that my child knew that. But from the mouth of the person that did it, instead of adding that burden to my soul of like, I have to answer those questions. Wouldn't it be great, kind of like Otis shared, about the lens of, okay, these are the abusers that created the crime, but what caused it? Who are they? Who are their parents? What community were they raised in? Were they your neighbors? Were they your colleagues? Were they your friends who ended up being the abusers? And like you were sharing, Angela, were we blind to it? We should be able to see them too, because in the end, the only way to break the cycle is to understand where it begins, right? And so I had to make sure that, yes, I want to be okay, I want to cry, but then my child, I don't want them to be poisoned. I don't want them to hate. I don't want them to grow up to be an abuser or accept abuse. How do I, and once again, going back to like trauma informed, right, a village, how do I take out of my own feelings and say, I don't want to never see this person again? But that's their father. So how am I going to make a productive child that's not going to feel abandonment if I am part of the problem of abandonment language? A lot of topics, sorry, but it's a lot of that. So I encourage you to read it, but I also encourage you to be that kind of reporter that gives the mic and says, and I love how they did it. They got my language and then they tweaked it, they edited it, and they came back to me. It's like, what do you think about this? And they gave me that voice like 3 different times. How about this? And I was like, well, for example, I want to make sure that the parent, now who's their father, that's their dad, is part of in a sentence in the story, because it took me a lot of work to know who to date. I went in 1,001 dates is a joke, right? You know, so that was part of my restorative justice. So, you know, but taking the time to give me the mic and walk with me and meet with me and say, how are you feeling along the way? It's making an impact in my healing. And so make sure you look for stories like that, because we're not gonna find healing easily in the justice system in court. Most likely our abuser will never do jail time. So what is the way that you as a village to us can help us find our feet again, find advocacy, find healing? And I think that's a great way. And hopefully you do read it so you get encouraged to do more stories like that.
Let's give some applause for your eloquence and your bravery. Thank you. And your call for compassion. Thank you. My final question for our panelists is for Angela and Sammy to say a word about the playbook, a quick word because of our timing. But, you know, this was also an example of kind of equalizing the power equation and involving survivors and journalists on equal footing, which doesn't always happen. So maybe say a word about that. And also just one insight from the playbook that you both want to share.
Yeah, well, I want to say we actually collaborated on a chapter about sharing power, which was pretty cool. So go check that one out. You know, something I think about a lot, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, is how do journalists actually design for impact? Like, I'd like to ask people at the start of an interview process, why are you doing this? Like, what do you want to get out of it for yourself? And like, what change could this journalism ultimately produce? And I know I'm not an activist. I'm not going to show up at a city council meeting and demand funding for something. But if there's an outcome that somebody would like to see, and it's a solution that I can write about, like, let's get it in there. And with one of my projects that I did with help from USC, we asked what the survivors would want out of the project. And they said, I just want the next person who goes through this to understand the system better than I understood it, because I just didn't know who to call or what to do. And so in addition to producing a podcast, we also produced a digital guide to reporting sexual assault in Sacramento County. And it's in PDF, it's online, thanks. It was my whole team. It wasn't just me, it was Michelle and a lot of people. But it was a usable tool. And like, that's what they really needed at that time. So I think the toolkit has other examples like that about how do you just think differently about what you're making?
Thanks so much, Sammy. I had such a lovely time working with the advisory group on developing the DV playbook. And it's one of, unfortunately, few experiences where my story was really respected and my status as a survivor was actually, it meant something. Because I have been on the other side where, you know, I was a bit younger and I didn't know a lot about like ethics and anonymity and things like that. And I just freely shared things, and there are things on the internet that I really regret sharing. But it's also not just on me, it's the people who were interviewing me that did not responsibly go through this process in a care-centered approach. So, you know, one of my key takeaways is like, please respect anonymity and confidentiality, because if you don't, it can have deadly consequences. I have left my abuser, and it's been maybe around almost 10 years, but I still am so fearful that he's going to find me and kill me. I still have nightmares about him killing me. So, you know, for journalists, they can take their hat off, right? And go home to their families. They can eat a nice meal after they've interviewed me, but I'm left crying. I'm left on the floor. I'm left having more nightmares. And I'm just in a weird funk for the rest of the month, maybe. And so I really encourage people who are doing this reporting to be care-centered, to really think about the dynamics of power and abuse, because you can even end up replicating those cycles of violence with this dynamic as a reporter and a survivor. And especially, the last thing I'll touch on is money. Of course, please pay your survivors. And I think with that comes the fact that when I am paid for speaking about my experiences, now I kind of feel obligated to share all the details because you're now paying me. But of course, survivors need to be paid, so it's such a slippery slope, honestly. But you know, really approaching that with care, and like Sammy shared and Yenny shared, making sure the survivor is brought along in the process. They're given their own agency. And I've seen this happen in our playbook. I witnessed it myself. I experienced it myself. And it's just been such an incredible joy. So please check out the DV playbook. We put a lot of care into the playbook.
I do want to mention that journalists cannot pay their sources. So I assume that you were talking more about you know, like if you're speaking or if you're writing or something like that. But I just want to mention that's maybe where just different conventions don't perfectly align. I just want to say that I feel like this room has had a kind of energy and a feeling of both frankness and caring, and that we've heard some really moving, revealing things from, I think, every single panelist here and from all of you in the audience. So I just want to thank everybody here. And please, let's just all have some applause for each other.